Hi everyone, so my name's Owen, and I'm here today to talk about two things really. One is what I've been doing with a project called SocketStream, and secondly, tying nicely into what Matthew's been talking about, how I've sort of newly getting into node streams and my experiences working with them. Okay, so a bit about SocketStream. Everything started really about 1.5 years ago now, when I started realizing that we're approaching this sort of new phase of the web. So we've traditionally always had static pages. We're now living in a world where most web apps are dynamic, which means that we're able to sort of get custom data, but the data on the screen is only a snapshot and it's not changing. And really what I think we're doing, we're just on the verge now of moving into real-time apps, where typically the data on the screen will be always refreshed and always current and always reflecting the most, sort of latest developments. And this is really good for things like dashboards or, monitoring sales or, monitoring aircraft in the sky or anything like that where you've got this constant stream of data coming in. So really, I've been on this ongoing quest to figure out the best way of building these apps, and not really just sort of like throwing a few hello world examples together, but making really sort of rich apps which can compete with desktop apps and also scale really well, rich, reliable, scalable apps. And that has sort of led to a whole series of experiments in a project which I've called SocketStream. And this has been going quite a while now. This is before the days of Meteor or anything like that. And we're sort of onto the third version now. And what really makes it a different framework to some other frameworks that you've used before, such as Express or Ruby on Rails, is that it's really only dedicated to doing a few particular things. So it's only concerned with single-page apps, and all the data that your app sends, all the application data that you typically retrieve off the database, always flows over the WebSocket. So it's kind of like the data on the wire idea as well. So the target audience that I'm really aiming this at are web developers like myself who don't mind getting their hands dirty and don't mind, sort of dealing with things like databases and NoSQL stuff or sort of figuring out where the data comes from and APIs. But they don't necessarily want to start dealing with the really boring essentials, such as essential things like compression and CDN and and all this sort of stuff, or even the sort of more complicated stuff like how do you multiplex different streams of data over a WebSocket. So that is really the target audience. It's not trying to make it really, really easy, but at the same time it's trying to relieve some of the burden, the monotonous stuff, and that's, I think, something that Ruby on Rails did very well. It allows developers to concentrate more on building the app, which is really important. So the goals of the project have always been the same, really. High performance, using the minimal amount of bandwidth, because it's incredibly important. How to scale stuff up with different transports so that it can be reliable. Not just like hundreds of connections, but hundreds of thousands. So this is talking about sort of distributed servers and things like that. It needs to be easy to get started. You need to be able to download it and feel like you're actually making progress with something that's fun and exciting. And I've always believed from the start that you should build your app completely separately to the underlying transport that it lives under. So at the moment, lots of people build on Socket.io, which we do use in SocketStream, but it's completely decoupled from the actual transport, so you can easily switch that out into different ones. Minimal client-side code, so we're actually up and running very quickly on mobile devices, and really trying to figure out how to get the best out of mobile, how to be well supported on all the platforms. So quite a lot of progress has been made on this already. We've already got a sort of stable release which you can use, you can download and start using today, and people have already started building production apps, things that, like minor stuff, but nevertheless things that they're hosting, this ranging from Facebook apps to a really good dashboard solution called dashku.com. And it certainly attracts a lot of attention, and what I'm really most pleased about is that we've now established an active community of people who want to make apps like this and are very helpful to any newcomers. So if you've got questions like, okay, well, how does this work over WebSockets? There's an IRC channel and there's a Google group which are very active now. There's still more progress to be made on things like documentation and example apps and things like that. But as I say, this is all an experiment in progress, and it's all coming along. So one of the questions that always gets asked, particularly in Node, is why bother with a framework? Well, first off, like I say, I think there's an important, there's a lot to be said for sort of just getting together a group of people with the same like-minded opinions of, right, this is the sort of app that we want to build, and get, sort of congregating around that idea. But the other more sort of harsh reality of the situation is that Node itself has never been designed to make web apps in a way. I mean, it's a web server, it's a back-end systems platform, so you can do TCP servers, UDP servers, but that out of core is as much as you get for the web server. So that leaves a lot to be desired in terms of how best to serve your assets, your CSS, and things like that, even before we even think about WebSockets. So these are the essential things that I believe that most web apps need today, and certainly all real-time apps, client sort of rich real-time apps. And these are some of the goals that SocketStream's looking to try and address, like how do we deal with things like, session and authentication. If anyone saw the Meteor thing last night that they released, I thought that was very impressive, like the sort of adding sort of Facebook and things like that in straight away. But one of the real essential differences with SocketStream is that we're taking a much more sort of lower level approach, and we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we sort of make the best out of the stuff that's already there in the Node community? How do we wire it up together to make the most out of that? So we're not trying to build a completely different platform. Things like asset packing, everything that gets served in production needs to be minified. Every byte needs to be squeezed out of it that we can. So these things are not things that some people need, but things that everybody should be doing, and it's just good practice, basically. On the other side of the coin, everybody is very contentiously loving things like CoffeeScript or hating CoffeeScript, and loving Stylus or loving Jade or hating them all, and wanted to write just raw HTML and raw CSS. So these are very opinionated things, and things like this should have no place, I think, in a sort of core framework, because otherwise you just end up sort of being, like say, this is the way to do things, and then 2 weeks later something else will come out, and that's all better. So these things are compatible with SocketStream, but they're implemented as optional modules, so you're not actually cluttering your code with stuff that you don't want to use. So very, very briefly, because I want to actually show some code of the new stuff I've been working on, I'm just going to fly through some of the features. As I said before, we're very sort of Node compatible. It's not its own little island where it doesn't talk to anything else. The whole idea is to try and get the best out of Node and plug together existing modules that exist already. We're focused on mobile, which means that we need to be able to write assets such as HTML, CSS, and things like that, and then choose the best combination of these to send to different devices. This can be really handy if you want to make like an admin interface to your website as well. So you could say, right, well, all these libraries are shared between the admin site and the main site, and we can just serve a subset of these. And SocketStream handles all the packing and the stuff behind the scenes for you. Client-side templates are very important whenever you're doing much on the client side, because otherwise you're sort of forever, concatenating strings and send them to divs and things like that. So there's lots of great template languages out there. One of the things I've definitely noticed, and I'm a big supporter of, is pre-compiling your client-side templates on the server, so they're only sending pure JS over the wire, basically. And this makes everything a lot faster. So if you've heard client-side templates are really slow, yes, they can be, but if you could pre-compile them on the server, you'll find that actually they're really, really fast. And SocketStream does that for you. So whether you want to use these or not depends, I think, on how much time you spend as your life as a professional client-side developer. Yes, some of these are big bloated frameworks, you may think, but actually when you start making real web apps, you start realizing that there are a lot of common problems, and these frameworks, my favorite at the moment is Angular, do a really good job, I think, of addressing some of them. And SocketStream works with all of these or none of them, and it's completely up to you. So you can drop in what you need. And then thanks to Substack, we've also integrated a portion of Browserify, which is a really good way of managing your client-side code and stopping it from sprawling everywhere. Because one of the real challenges with rich client-side apps is how exactly are you going to manage all that code. And the common JS modules that we use in Node already actually turn out to be a really good solution to this. It also means that you can easily share code between your client and your server, which is really cool. And there's a big focus on designing stuff for the future, so things like push state support is built in, and it just makes it easier as well to do things like web workers. As I mentioned before, we're completely abstracted away from the transport, so by default you use Socket.io, but you can easily switch with just one line of code to Socket.js and your app just works beautifully. So, and this has become really useful actually recently, because there were some problems with when iOS 6 came out. And I think, initially, like for a few days, Socket.js didn't work. So it's really, really handy to be able to move over for different transports. And both of them also work differently, which is quite interesting for scaling. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just show you quickly how to make an app, and then focus the rest of my talk on what I've been doing since. So basically, what I've done here is I've done npm install SocketStream. And I'm just going to make a project called Dublin. And it's basically generated some files which are going to be useful to actually build this up. Now, whether or not you generate files is always a contentious issue. I think it's nice, it's sometimes nice to get up and running quickly with something that actually works. Whilst I'm talking, I'm just going to install this. So pm install. So I'm just following the instructions. Sorry, I need to do cd Dublin. Okay, so that's installing. And by default, you get things like stylus, but you don't have to use them. They're all optional modules, which you don't need to use if you don't want to. Yeah, so I think there's actually quite a good advantage of generating files. But one of the things I've learned sort of doing this, and I'm learning all the time, is that it's better to design your framework from the start so you don't have to do that. And that's indeed what we're doing in the next version. Okay, so all I need to do now is to start. My app is Node app, and I can go straight into here. And so by default, when you do this, when you download SocketStream npm, you get this, and you can go hello world, and it's showing here. But also if I then open my Safari up, you'll notice that we're just sharing exactly, because we're using the WebSockets, I can go hello again, and you'll see in the background that it's actually now been broadcast to both. So setting that up with Socket.io, or sort of assembling the components can be done, and it will take you a little while. But we sort of figured out the best way of plumbing stuff together, and you get that by default. Okay, so towards the future, let's have a look. If I just unmirror things again. Okay, so what I want to do is just briefly cover things that we don't do, and it's quite important. Okay, so often people say, oh yes, this looks great, I'll make a blog about it, or I'll make my new blog, use SocketStream. That's actually kind of like not what it's intended to do. We're trying to tackle a very narrow set of problems, which is things, basically web applications which could just be desktop applications or iPad applications. So if you think, well, what would work really well on an iPad, there's a very good chance it will work very well in SocketStream too. So things like, if you're doing stock trading or you're monitoring live sensor data, that's a really, really good choice for SocketStream. You can, of course, experiment with things like, real-time social stuff and all that sort of thing. But if there's a lot of sort of content that you want to be published and get into Google, it's definitely not a good choice to use SocketStream, and nor do we ever want to sort of address that. Typically, most SocketStream apps, you'll need a login to actually progress, so you'll need to log in to do anything anyway, so it's a bit pointless trying to support that. The other thing, which is a big design decision, is that there are no models supported in the core. So things like Meteor and Derby as well, have this concept of models, and then everything, you change the model and it reflects the template. Well, that is actually really, really handy. But the problem is that nobody can agree on how to do this yet. So all of those solutions use Mongo, which is great if you want to use Mongo, but what happens if you want to use React or something else? So we don't implement models in the core whatsoever, and we never will. But instead what we do, and this is basically explaining some of those issues, instead what we do is we have this API which you can use to build these sort of model solutions on. The other reason we don't do models is because they're not always needed. And if you think about the way that web apps are built these days, you've typically got your web clients, but you've also got your mobile clients here, which are typically accessing the same API servers. So the way that we build apps is changing, and whereas in the old days Rails would start with like a models folder and a views folder and things like that, and everything would be in there, a lot of people now are just only using Rails to serve the API because they need to be able to make that data accessible to different devices. So as I said, we have this thing called the Request Responder API. Right, I have 6 minutes left, so I'm going to fly through. Okay, so what's coming next? So I was working on this sort of next version for probably about 3 or 4 weeks, and everything was coming along really nicely. I've made the decision to move away from CoffeeScript and write the actual core in JavaScript, and so integrate Engine.io, which is fantastic. And then I went to AlexJS two weeks ago or so, and this happened, which was. So that's crazy streams talk, which was absolutely mind-blowing, and I was very interested in following progress with streams for a while, but this just blew me away, and I just thought straight away, this is an idea that's too good to be ignored. So sort of just out on the cuff about 5 days ago, I thought, well, what happens if we start again from scratch with streams in mind from the start, and if we try and build a new framework which is basically everything could be piped together to make what you need and give you a much more better level of control. So I'm just going to show you some code. Now the code I just put on today on GitHub about 30 minutes ago, whatever, and that's a URL. So what I'm about to show you now, you can have a look at this. It literally is 4 days old, so expect it doesn't do a lot, but there is a tutorial and there is also a API guide. So one of the new things I'm trying to do now is make sure that we're much more it's a lot easier to learn this stuff, and sort of really emphasizing documentation. So please do check it out. Okay. Right. Let me show you some code. Right, let's try and get the screen right here. Okay, so everyone knows this. This is basically basic web server in Node. And what I've done, and this is a code that's on GitHub now, is that we can move away from that and we can progressively enhance it so that at no point do you feel, oh my God, I've just given everything over to a black box. Instead, you're actually learning. This is what the tutorial does on the GitHub project. You're learning bit by bit how things work. So nothing at any point should ever feel like you're just sort of moving over to a black box. Okay, so this code here, all we're doing here is we're initializing a new project, and we're also defining a single page client, and we're saying that the HTML that we should send is called main, and that lives in the project. Okay, so I'm just going to run this code here. So this one here, that was version 3 previously. So this is number 2, slide 2. Okay, so that's hello world there. Nothing very exciting. Okay, and then moving on, what we're saying here is we're going to pass some CSS. So what SocketStream does is it takes your HTML and it injects the tags that you need in the right order so that we're optimized for loading. So basically what we've done here is we've defined a CSS file here. And also what we've done here, you'll notice, is we've starting to use streams to actually pass things around. So we've got a stream here which takes the HTML and injects the right asset tags into it before piping it to the request object. And then also I put a conditional rule in here to say if you're looking at the root of the website, we want to serve the HTML. But for anything else, give it to this module and that will take care of the CSS for you. Okay, so let me just run this one here. So this is example 3. Okay, so we've now got CSS loaded, and if I actually do view source, what you'll see is that the tags are actually put in automatically. So these are system tags. Don't worry about how they look, because when you go into production, all this will be minified for you automatically. Okay, so example 4, what happens if you want to use something like Jade? Well, there's no streaming API for Jade at the moment, so I had to really create something very quickly to do this. So this is my streaming Jade API, and what I'm doing now, you can notice down here, is that we're taking the HTML code, piping it through Jade, taking the Jade code, piping it through Jade here, and you can see that, I think, yeah, we're at full.jade. And we're chaining stuff together so that before the inject asset tagging is called, it's actually transformed into raw HTML before actually outputting. So let me run this example now. I think that's going to be 4. Okay, so we're starting to come closer to the home page that we saw earlier, the sort of start page. So that's the Jade code, and the Jade code, it lives just down here, so full.jade, looks like that. Okay. So what about things like compression? So this is using Substack's oppressor module, which is basically taking all this output and then also compressing it. So it's adding gzip compression before it goes to the browser, only if the browser supports it, which is really cool. So I won't show you that because it looks exactly the same. It's just gzipped. And then things like, what's this one do? Okay, right. Okay, so we've just moved from that code here, and if you want to assemble every single little thing, you can, but what we can say, and this is what SocketStream does, is it say, right, well, let's make an assumption here that every web developer should be compressing their code, and perhaps would also want to write in something like a preprocessor like Jade as well. And I certainly recommend you do. So if you want to do that, and only if you want to do, you can actually condense that. So now what we're doing is we're saying, we've got a new command here called view, and that is the sort of best practice way of doing this, which 99% of you will want to do. So it's there if you want it, but you don't have to use it. And then what you can see now is we're starting to clean up this code a bit. Furthering on, let's say you want to use stylus. Okay, so what we do now is we're actually using stylus here. This is a stylus file for our CSS, which looks like that. I'm going over, so I'm going to have to stop. And finally, let me just see. Final example is HTTP routing. So what I've done now is I've replaced this whole thing here where we had our own little router and just written one rule here. Because if you want to go to the sort of root of your site / do the main client, but what we could also do, let's say we wanted to do an admin page, is we could set up an admin client earlier, and we could do like that. Okay, and then, so these are the sort of things that we're doing. So it's all progressive enhancement. At no point do you actually feel like, oh, I've lost and surrendered control. So you can pipe everything if you want to, or you can make use of the shortcuts if you want to too. And I think it's a much better way of doing a web framework. So very, very quickly, just to finish up. There we go. So that's the code. So it's not in the main repo yet because it's all very experimental. Finally, just to say, I think one thing that SocketStream has proved so far is that there's a lot of interest in building apps this way. There's a really active community. There's an audience there already. And if you want to get involved in doing this, I really encourage you. Please either send me an email or take the code, have a play with it, send pull requests and so on. And also, if you're interested in building a product that uses this technology, also get in touch as well. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.